afternoon, everybody. My name's Annie Kelly. I'm a journalist and an editor at The Guardian, and I'm currently heading up The Guardian's Modern Slavery and Trafficking Special Journalism Project. We're here to mark the launch of the ILO's 50 for Freedom campaign to end modern slavery. I know some of you have come a very, very long way, so I'd like to say how much we appreciate your efforts. And we'd also like to welcome those who are joining us online through our special web chat. I know most of you have been through a couple of days of really intensive discussions at the Innovation Forum. And what we're really hoping today is that we can get everything that you've seen and heard, all of your experiences, all of your thoughts, and have a really lively debate around all of the efforts that are needed to eradicate forced labour, which I know might be slightly ambitious after 2 days of very intensive discussions, but let's do our best. As we all know, slavery still pervades every corner of the globe today. As we just heard, there are 21 million people trapped in some form of forced labour. It's a business that generates $150 billion in profit, in illegal profits every year, and no country or community is immune from it. So obviously it's vital that we do everything that we can to find ways of bringing this to an end. In June last year, the ILO, together with trade unions, governments, and employers all came together to ratify a new ILO protocol on forced labour. And this new international treaty now requires governments to take specific and concrete measures on preventing forced labour, but also protecting and extending access to justice for victims. And as 90% of forced labour happens in the private sector, it also gives employers a specific role and responsibility in any national anti-slavery policies for the first time. Now, we're here to launch the ILO's 50 for Freedom campaign, and the ILO aims to get 50 governments to ratify this treaty by 2018. I was told today that Niger, I think, is the first country to ratify this, so we're hoping that other governments kind of follow hot on their heels. First, can I introduce Sharon Burrow? She's the General Secretary of the International Trade Union Confederation. Chris Sider is the CBI's governing body representative for the ILO. Sharon, can you sit there? for the ILO, and the CBI's management board representative for the International Organization of Employers. We have Leonardo Sakamoto, the founder of Reporter Brazil, a member of the board of the United Nations Voluntary Trust Fund on Contemporary Forms of Slavery, and Simon Stain, special advisor of the Fundamental Principles of Rights at Work. So what we're going to do is we're going to start by asking each of our panellists a question, and then we're going to go on to hopefully spend as much time as we can on a kind of interactive discussion with you guys. So Simon, I was hoping that you'd be able to introduce the protocol to all of us as quickly as you can. We've got about 5 minutes each. So I'd like to start by asking you, what is the ILO's protocol on forced labour, and how do you think it's going to make a difference?
Well, thanks very much, Annie. It is a bit of a sobering reminder, isn't it, that we have to have the event today. Global interest in combating modern slavery has increased in recent years, no doubt, but the response is still far short of addressing the challenge. You've heard what the 50 for Freedom campaign is. The new protocol updates the original Convention on Forced Labour from 1930, which was really conceived at a period when most forced labour was exacted, frankly, under colonial oppression. And what the new protocol reflects, frankly, is the growing understanding of forced labour and trafficking as symptoms of contemporary and dysfunctional globalised labour markets. We just heard 21 million men, women and children in various forms of forced labour coerced to work under threat of penalty, or in work for which they've not offered themselves voluntarily. And just to introduce these basics about the protocol, of course the most poorest and excluded people are most vulnerable. 44% of the 21 million you mentioned, Annie, are internal or cross-border migrants and refugees. 5.5 million of the 21 million are children. The largest single group are still adults and children in bonded labour. As you said, 90% are exploited by private individuals or businesses. More than 1.5 million are in developed countries, including the European Union. And of the staggering 150 million profit you mentioned, $1 billion of profit, illegal profit made from modern slavery each year, 47% of that is made in developed economies and a further 18% in the non-EU countries in Southeast Europe and the CIS states. And to remind you, and just to avoid unhelpful conflation, 20% we estimate of contemporary forced labour is estimated to be in commercial sexual exploitation, while the rest, 80%, is exacted in other sectors and services. Now, the language of the protocol, it's not just the content that's up to date. The language, you'll note, language such as due diligence, the need to protect and compensate victims who suffer serious violations of their human rights. And it reaffirms, the protocol reaffirms the obligations of states to punish perpetrators of forced labour and to end this all too pervasive impunity. Ratifying member states are obliged to strengthen protection for victims, enable victims to access remedy and compensation, and design effective prevention policies. And the groundbreaking provisions on remedies are to ensure indeed that victims can access remedies, including compensation, irrespective of their presence or legal status in the country in which the abuse has occurred. And that matters not least because it means an exploiter can't escape the law and the wages owed to the worker by being complicit in having them deported as an illegal migrant. If properly implemented, the protocol's provisions on remedies and compensation, not just from states with a duty to protect, again, here the ruggy language, but also in damages and unpaid wages won back from perpetrators, will not only provide justice to victims of forced labour, it should also make it less profitable to use forced labour and will help combat unfair competition based on forced labour. Now, the protocol also underlines the mutually reinforcing nature of all fundamental rights at work, including the importance of freedom of association and the right to collective bargaining, because workers who can exercise those rights have a stronger position at the bargaining table, a louder voice to deal with public authorities and access the law, and a presence to ensure their workplaces are free of modern slavery. Of course, we need these comprehensive solutions. Strict punishment of those who profit from modern slavery is essential, but it's not enough on its own. Penal sanctions need to be complemented by strong preventive measures to strengthen labour law and its implementation, protect workers against fraudulent practices. You all know, we've discussed this in the ETI now for years, how much these fraudulent practices of unscrupulous labour brokers often are the first step of trafficking, to extend basic social security guarantees and provide access to skills and education and training, as well as to improve victim care and compensation. And if this is a human rights objective, the rights holders themselves have to be able to exercise their rights to live and work in freedom. I've said this before, but human rights are not something that elites do to disempowered people. They exist when they're exercised in the daily lives of rights holders. I rather like Desmond Tutu's prosaic quote. I mean, he's an Anglican bishop, so he would say this: "My human rights are God-given. I don't run around yelling, 'Hey, boss, please make me free.'" And that's the core. We're talking about essential human freedoms. So the disempowerment of working people, especially in the informal and the rural economies and the formal economy precariat, need to be redressed if the aims of the protocol are to be achieved. A lack of agency makes people more vulnerable to trafficking and forced labour, not least when their vulnerability is heightened if they migrate to work in circumstances in which their rights as migrants are not protected under law. Contemporary slavery is an immense challenge, and since the adoption of the ILO's Declaration on Fundamental Rights back in 1998, we've promoted the ratification of all the fundamental rights conventions on freedom of association and collective bargaining and freedom from forced labour, child labour and discrimination. So today's event, Annie, provides an opportunity to reflect on what we can do better together to achieve the common goal of eliminating forced labour once and for all, and it includes the need to do all we can to encourage governments to ratify the new protocol and then implement it, because without implementation, it's not freedom, it's just paper. That's the message. 50 ratifications for freedom as a first step towards fulfilling our global obligations. Thanks for letting me. I haven't gone clause by clause. You'd shoot me if I did. But I hope that trying not to be like an old-fashioned ILO official, but I hope that gives you the core of the stuff that really matters for you as member companies, particularly of the ETI and ETI stakeholders in other respects. Thank you very much.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I think that's given us a really good framework for the rest of the event. Thrillingly, we now have Wagner Moura live from Brazil. Oh. Hello, Wagner. Can you hear us?
Hi.
Hello. Thank you very much.
Hello,
for
can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Can you hear us?
Yes, but yeah, I can hear you.
You can hear us. Brilliant. Well, sorry about the technical hitch. Thank you very much. I believe you're in Bogota. Filming.
Hi, good afternoon. I would love to be with you today. I'm here in Bogota. I'm in Colombia. I'm working on a series. But I'd like to say that my name is Wagner Moura, and I'm deeply honored to be with you today as an ILO Goodwill Ambassador. I'm very proud to support the launch of the 50 for Freedom campaign for the ratification of the new ILO protocol and to shed light on the crime of forced labor. The need for global ratification couldn't come at a more critical time. When it comes to modern slavery, we have to fight to change minds, policies, laws, regulations, and most of all, to change hearts. It's very important that we change people's perception of modern slavery. Many ordinary people don't even know slavery still exists, while 21 million are suffering from it right now. And what's even worse, in my opinion, many enslaved persons are not aware of their own terrible condition. Some even think they deserve it. Modern slavery, which accounts for over $150 billion in illegal profits each year, is mostly the final stage of human trafficking, another related scourge of our society. And what fuels this evil underground economy, in my opinion, is mainly one thing: poverty. Because no wealthy man finds himself mining ore for pennies per day against his will. No wealthy man takes a job on a squalid fishing boat chained to his bunk every night. No wealthy man leaves his family to work on farm fields where he's not going to be allowed to go back home. No wealthy man works 17 hours a day on his feet and gets beaten up when he can't stand any longer. No wealthy woman takes a job where she can end up being raped and forced into prostitution. No wealthy child works at a factory from sunset to sunrise. So no one who has a choice gets trapped into modern slavery. Poverty and desperation lead to it. In the last couple of weeks, we all have watched thousands of people streaming into Europe in search of a better life. With barely more than their clothes, they're getting caught in razor wire, hit with water cannons by security forces, and being pushed by soulless journalists. And who can forget the heartbreaking photo of that little boy who drowned on the beach? But while their suffering is heart-wrenching, there is another sad phase that is about to begin for these people. Thousands of them could become slaves. I grew up in a very poor region in the northeast of Brazil, and when I was a kid, I watched people being exploited and working in very bad conditions. It was normal, or so I assumed. Some affluent families, for example, would sympathetically offer the struggling parents of a 12-year-old girl to take her in to live in their family home as a daughter. But in fact, it meant having a slave at home. This child would become responsible for all domestic chores in the house without receiving any compensation for it, only food and a roof. And I grew up thinking this kind of thing was normal and even kind. Maybe this is what happens when you grow up in the last Western country to abolish slavery. Sakamoto is there and he can speak much better about the Brazilian situation, but it was only in 1888 that Brazil abolished slavery, and its legacy remains a fundamental part of our modern culture. It has been only in recent years, for example, that Brazilian domestic workers, mostly black women, have gained a level of protection under modern labor laws. So one thing I have learned is that the very first step to fight against this practice is calling it by the name it actually has: slavery. It's called slavery. While I said with regret that slavery is part of the Brazilian soul, I can also say with pride that Brazil is one of the leading countries in fighting this shameful practice. I have no doubt the most important weapon we all have is information. In Brazil, we used to have a public list with the names of individuals and companies that have been caught making use of this type of degrading labor. This list's publication by the government was unfortunately recently suspended by the Brazilian Supreme Court, responding, of course, to pressure from the reactionary forces that dominate Brazil today. In a country that will proudly host the Olympics next year, and an economy that's the 8th largest in the world, the fight against slave labor is not an easy fight. And the enemies are much more powerful and organized than we can imagine. Because no one says publicly that they support slavery. Because these voices, they don't show up publicly. They speak in the shadows. Again, modern slavery generates $150 billion in profits every year. So getting 50 countries to ratify the ILO protocol by 2018 is not as easy as it seems. So especially for those of us here today, it's our duty not only to sign up for the campaign, but also to reach out to governments, NGO leaders, opinion makers, legislators, the crown prince of a nation, the CEO of a global corporation, the school your kids go to, people in your neighborhood. I strongly encourage you to do so. Share the facts about modern slavery and show everyone the faces of this gigantic scar on the civilized world. I am deeply committed to doing all I can to accomplish it. Please join me in supporting the 50 for Freedom campaign in whatever capacity you can. And let's eradicate this shameful practice once and forever. Thank you.
Sharon, I wanted to ask you, that was a very passionate speech that really kind of showed the urgency and the commitment that we all need to try and really, join the fight to eradicate modern slavery. I was wondering, just going back to the protocol, why is this important? Why is it that the ITUC felt that it was really important to get this new protocol in place?
Well, because modern day slavery is growing. It's not something that's a remnant now of some terrible ancient tradition. It's growing. And in fact, 21 million is absolutely cautious, as the ILO should be. But we have, indications that it could be, up to 35 million. It's just extraordinary. And it exists in places you wouldn't believe. Like, people know about trafficking for sex slavery. That's really bad. People know about child labour. That's really bad. But, nobody spoke out about companies in Qatar using the kafala system, where you're effectively, like anyone else, owned by another human being. Everything you do, from your contract, squalid accommodation, no life, unpaid wages, no remedy, and then, of course, ultimately not even able to leave the country, everything you do requires the permission of one other human being. That's slavery. And then, of course, we think, oh, yes, but these are countries where, they're not quite in that civilised realm and it'll be fixed over time. Well, you have tomato pickers in Italy providing product for the supermarkets right throughout Europe, here in the UK, and they're slaved. You saw the people standing up for themselves in Greece picking strawberries shot because they wanted fair wages. It's everywhere. And last month, a team of ours went with support from a lot of you, so thank you very much, to Mauritania, because domestic workers in Mauritania were becoming the victims and being jailed for speaking out against, maltreatment by their employers. The government, thankfully, not yet ratified the protocol, Simon, but it's a country where they have a history of slavery that's not yet ended. But to be fair to them, they actually suspended the visas for domestic workers to Saudi Arabia, and they've stopped the companies who were, in fact, engaged in the scam from perpetrating it further for the minute. So we have three simple messages. Clearly, we supported a protocol, because if you had to bring something back into force as a global tool, we had to do something, and this was it. And we thank the employers and the governments for their support. Now we need to ratify it. But frankly, to companies here, Why do business in a slave state? Why? All you have to say is, no, we're not going to work there. And guess what? You would change the world for those desperate people. We say to governments, why do you allow your companies, without any kind of prosecution, to do business in a slave state? Do what Mauritania did. Stop the visas. It'll change overnight. So again, the will to act, yes, ratify the protocol, but let's have the political and corporate will to act.
Thank you. Chris, we heard 90% of forced labour... 90% of forced labour happens in private businesses and under private employment. Why? Obviously, it's important that employers get on board. What should be their role in actually taking a very active stance in doing something effective to push forward the fight against slavery?
Thank you, Annie. That's a simple question to answer, isn't it? If I had the answer on what is the role for employers, then I would be a genius. The reality is that the role for employers is evolving, and the role for socially responsible employers is now to properly engage. Now, for those who don't know me, my day job, I'm a lawyer. Okay, so I come to this issue with a very pragmatic and possibly too much of a legalistic input. And I can't speak as eloquently as Sharon or as Wagner or indeed yourself, Annie. But in respect of how business responds to this issue, if you want to help business become more engaged, there is a language issue, and I would talk to you in respect of supply chain management, and I would talk to you with regards to the fact that no, and I repeat, no socially responsible CEO wants slavery in his or her supply chain. Now the role for business, let's be frank, is going to have to be multifaceted because of the way that business operates, because supply chains are complex. It's not just the role for multinationals, I would argue, it's the role for everyone within that supply chain. And at this stage in this journey, I would submit to you that the role for employers is to engage passionately and proactively and not to be a passenger in this process.
Okay,
I hope you don't mind me being provocative, because I really would like to have a good debate this afternoon.
Yeah, and I hope that we can come back to that. You've raised some really interesting points. I think there's a lot to get into there. Leonardo, you've been doing some amazing stuff on the ground in Brazil. Wagner already talked about what's happening there. I know that you've been under lots of pressure as well in your work out there. I was just wondering if you could just expand a bit and tell us about the environment that you're facing in Brazil and some of the work that you've been doing recently.
Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon, Wagner. And, well, I took malaria 2 times in my life making war coverage, and it hurts a lot. I don't suggest for anyone. At least I became thinner, and but now I'm fat again. Well, happens. But when you took malaria, it's interesting because you don't solve your problem if you take aspirin every day. You will die. Aspirin will solve your headache of the malaria or your pains, but does not solve the malaria issue. You need to take a specific medicine for malaria. Why? The headache in malaria is a symptom, it's not a disease. Slave labor is not a disease, slave labor is a symptom. This is the first question, this is the problem. And the system to fight against slavery in Brazil, we realized that, and the system covered not just the fight and rescue workers. We released 50,000 workers since 1995 when the Brazilian federal government created the public system to rescue workers. But it's not enough, because this is equal you try to dry ice. You must make other actions and other policies at the same time to fight systemically against slavery. You must fight against slavery rescue workers. You must work against poverty, because as Wagner told, poverty is the mother of slave labor. But you have to fight against the mother and the father, that's the impunity, too, and send people to the jail and cut profits from slavery. And if the mother is the poverty and the father is the impunity. The environment where slave labor grows, in much cases, is called illegal outsourcing, in fact. Something that was invented here in England during the Industrial Revolution, and the word copied since then. And we have an environment that promotes this, and the system to fight against slavery in Brazil considers this environment. We are working to try to approve laws. The best law that approved in the last year was a constitutional amendment that permit to confiscate lands and urban properties where people find slave labor and send this to agrarian reform programs or housing programs. At the same time, the state of São Paulo approved a law banning for 10 years any company that receive any benefit from slave labor force of work. You should think, "Bo, this is too strong, this is too complicated. No, let's talk." No, there is no talk. And this is very important to talking about slave labor. Slave labor is not a problem, a labor problem. It's a human rights issue. And I finished my initial talk saying that it's complicated because Brazil develops a lot of tools, economic tools, supply chain tools. We engage the private sector, not voluntarily, but we oblige the engagement after the publicized information about the supply chain. We made them to sign commitments. And you think, wow, and then probably the slave labor is almost solved in Brazil. No, far from that. Why? Because we are living now a pushback moment. You have, as Wagner told, conservative forces working against these goals that we got. And we need the international scenario, we need the international community working together to develop some tools like Brazilian developed. Why? Because the exploitation of labor is internationally. It's not something, this supply chain that began in Brazil passed from China back to Europe, finalized in the United States. We need to develop together international tools to fight against slavery. On the other hand, we just will dry ice in Brazil too. And to finish, I promise, I wonder if one day the International Labour Organization or the High Commissioner Office for Human Rights of the United Nations would have the same power held by World Trade Organization and International Monetary Fund. Why? Because the capital is free for go to everywhere, but the laborers don't. And as Wagner told, while we don't create measures and policies to work internationally to fight against slavery internationally, people will still be enslaved anywhere or dying, try to cross seas and deserts. Thank you.
Thank you. Wagner, can you hear us now? Are you able to hear us?
I can hear you now. Thank you very much.
Okay, great. Before we start, hopefully you'll have some questions from our audience here, but I wanted to ask you, obviously you're obviously very passionate about this. I was wondering what you thought were the biggest challenges in getting people, I mean, not at a state level, but ordinary citizens, consumers, young people, young activists. What do you think are the biggest challenges in getting people really engaged with this issue of forced labour or slavery? What are the big challenges that we face?
Like I said, I think that information is the most important thing. I believe that I grew up, like I said, in this very poor part of Brazil, and I grew up thinking that, I was witnessing people working in very, very bad conditions, and I thought that was normal. And I believe that many ordinary people in the Western world don't know how bad the situation is. And I think that the very first step is making people aware of it. And what I think it's actually worse is that many enslaved people don't know that they are that they are slaves. And I think that that's brutal. That's really, really sad and terrible. And I think that, so I truly believe, so I think that the fight against slave labor is a fight, first of all, is a fight against poverty, because these are the most vulnerable people, but it's also a fight of information, of making people anywhere, people, know that this is something that it's really, that's going on. This is not something of centuries ago. This is something that's going on now. And we shouldn't accept that. Young people in the 21st century shouldn't accept this in the civilized world.
Okay, thank you. I'm hoping that what we might be able to do later is also talk about the difficulties in recognising that the slavery of hundreds of years ago is very different to some of the forms of slavery that we see today. So that idea that the kind of physical, those physical shackles may have been replaced by more subtle forms of coercion and exploitation, debt bondage, other forms of bonded labour, exploitation in formal workplaces as well. But first I was hoping that we could just kind of get everybody involved and start taking some questions from the floor. So anybody like to kick the whole thing off? This gentleman here.
Rhys McCarthy, National Officer for Unite. Chris, you said that it's complex and that CEOs of companies are not in favour of slavery. I see it's a bit like heads of tobacco companies are not in favour of their smokers getting cancer. But the business models that they have often lead to the exploitation. Yesterday I was watching a programme on Channel 4 and it was quite clear this is akin to what they were running of exploitation of Romanian workers working in the UK within the fruit market, supplying leading supermarkets like Sainsbury's. And there was clearly go-betweens, kind of gangmasters in Romania. The poor people, and the poverty again is driving this, they were paying these go-betweens money to be transported over to the UK. We're told lies, huge lies on the amount of money they get, the working conditions. And then they come to the UK and they're working in, which I would say, near slavery conditions, and housed in caravans were not fit for pigs, let alone human beings. So I don't think it's as complicated as you suggest. If there were criminal responsibilities on CEOs within the supply chain, this situation would stop, I believe, very, very quickly.
Chris, would you like to address that?
The reason I'm pausing in that situation is the fact that it'd be very trite and very easy for me to just go, I agree in these circumstances, because absolutely as a human being, I personally do agree with you. The issue that I see when I'm representing business and helping businesses find their way through this complex issue, and the reason it's complex is simply because there is no one-size-fits-all solution, is what I encounter is the difficulties within business of those responsible for, say, human resources, procurement, supply chain management, to actually properly engage with the board, to actually, and dare I say it, sell the importance of socially responsible supply chains and eradicating these issues. And the reason I would still argue that it is complex is the fact that what I've observed for many years is the fact that many organisations will then turn to auditing and they'll turn to reporting and codes of conduct, and they are great initiatives. But what you're talking about is actually action to prevent this, and that's where it clearly isn't carrying through.
But can I just
Of
respond
course,
to that
yeah.
too? Action to prevent it, sure, let's work with companies, but it's a crime. I mean, let's call it a crime. And if you had a piece of contract law where somebody could constantly undermine, ignore any kind of form of rule of law around contracts, business would be saying, give us the rule of law now. And if it needs to be cross-border, in fact, ISDS is cross-border, and companies want to take profits from citizens for potentially lost income. You're right. demand the rule of law. If we could prosecute 4 companies in this country, 1 company even, 4 companies across Europe, who knows, big names, because they didn't do the due diligence and there is slavery in their supply chains, I'd even let them off, sanctions, if you could actually expose the fact that they're not doing due diligence. I don't even necessarily want CEOs to go to jail. I want them to do what you're saying, and that is due diligence. So if it's a rule of law, if 5 countries in Europe actually said due diligence is mandatory, there's a bill, the UK slavery bill, let's use it. It has potential for cross-border prosecutions, let's use it. But we don't have it elsewhere yet, and we need it for all our supply chains, because the minute we clean it up, because it's not acceptable as a crime, or the use of other breaches of labour rights, we will change the model of supply chains. But we need to be in partnership with the businesses who do say. I used the Citramina case in New York a few weeks ago during the UN General Assembly piece. There were 3 CEOs on a panel with me, and I described what you heard this morning, which is slave labour on ships in Indonesian waters, out of the Philippines, months on end, no sanitary conditions, no appropriate bedding arrangements, everybody at the behest of one employer. And each of those CEOs said, we wouldn't want that in our supply chain. I believe them. So let's give them the protection of the rule of law. Let's not talk CSR, which has failed.
Leonardo?
Just comment too, I love this issue. And first of all, I think that I'm waiting so hard that the discussions about the abiding treaty involving companies go ahead. I'm hoping that we can be able to grow from voluntary principles for something more to engage the companies to make them responsible for that. Because our history in the fight in the slave labor in Brazil, we face a lot of problems, for example, with automobile industry. We came to automobile industry in Brazil and say, people, we discovered that slave labor in supply chains, in your supply chains, we discovered slave labor in your supply chains. Where? In charcoal camps that are raw material for pig iron, that are raw material for steel, that are parts of automobile industry. And they say, oh, but we need to talk with our headquarters in the United States. And then we came to United States, to Detroit, and we talked with the headquarters. Oh, there is slave labor there. Oh, no, but their company in Brazil, it's another company, it's not our, not us. And I say, okay, then it's not a problem if we block the royalties that Brazil pays to the headquarters in the United States and use these royalties to clean the supply chain in Brazil. No, it's not like that. You are being so radical. And say, no. And then we back to Brazil and back to US, back to Brazil, back to US. I believe that the country where is the headquarters of the company must responsibilize the company. It should responsibilize the company by what the company do out borders. Oh, but there is no jurisprudence about it. Create it. Let's do it. Let's do it different.
Can I just add, just on the what the protocol says as well, it does call for national plans of action through tripartite consultation between governments, employers and trade unions. It does call for effective measures in a whole series of areas, education of both vulnerable workers, education of employers who may have so they can avoid forced labour in their value chains. It talks about the need to support due diligence, but it doesn't mean that a government can't go beyond it and introduce legislation. Slavery is in almost every jurisdiction, exacting slavery is a criminal offence. A non-bailable, as they say in India, criminal offence. And in most countries it is punishable under law. You can strengthen them. There's another protocol doesn't prevent any member state, and certainly not through tripartite consultation, getting together with the trade unions and the employers and saying, actually, we want to go beyond this. We do want to have regulation. We do want to say that due diligence should not just be an obligation, but we will find ways to support industry to do better due diligence. And in fact, I have a question for the audience, which is how does the audience, the companies, see the protocol and the demands for due diligence fitting in any case, to what you're already discussing, which is the due diligence requirements of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. It's not as if this is introducing new language. You've had the Ruggie Principles predating the protocol. You're already, all of you, engaged in this discussion about how do we exercise due diligence? How do we map our supply chains to know what's going on? How do we know what our contracting and subcontracting relationships are? What do we need to do to reduce that risk and find out what the problems are? But I would say one thing to Annie. It's absolutely right that we are seeing new modern forms of slavery in this new model, is the underbelly, if you like, of this modern version of globalisation. Everywhere in the world, from farms in Britain to sugar plantations in the global south. Everywhere.
I mean,
But I would say this, there is also that other bit that Sharon touched on so strongly about the rule of law, and you did too, Leonardo, and that is that we also have a big chunk of forced labour, modern slavery or contemporary slavery, that actually hasn't changed that much, that is still based on rural feudalism, landlordism, people in brick kilns not producing for global markets. The rule of law needs to be applied there too. We have these two extremes. Sharon's made the point about the rule of law, and that has to underpin all of the response.
Yeah, I mean, obviously part of the problem is in a lot of cases those laws at a state level are in place. It's about enforcement, it's
Absolutely.
about implementation. I think the gentleman was right in suggesting that maybe if you had a legislation along the same lines as the bribery and corruption legislation that's in place that holds CEOs personally accountable, that might be something that would incentivise business to suddenly start making sure that their supply chains are clean. Maybe a point that we can come back to. I'd like to take another question from the floor. This gentleman here.
I want to make this less complicated for Chris. I want to make this less complicated. What can we expect British employers, as a constituent of the International Organization of Employers, to do and say to, for example, their Brazilian counterparts about what they expect from their Brazilian counterparts, what they would like to see by way of less political recalcitrance, less resistance to the rule of law in Brazil against slavery, and in general, what they'd like to see from Brazilian employers in exercising corporate responsibility.
This is an amazing question. I can't. No? No, it's an amazing question because I would like to say, well, first of all, there is several levels of this answer, in fact. First of all, there is something that we are building for several years, the civil society organizations and the National Pact for the Eradication of Slave Labor. That's an international commitment to bring international companies that are in other companies in the United States, in England, in Spanish, to try to make part of this agreement and start to check using the dirty list of slave labor as a reference to check before buy from Brazil. Because in 2006, the United States tried to start to discuss a trade barrier for Brazilian pig iron. And then we said, oh, it's not necessary to raise a trade barrier for the entire sector because this will bring poverty to the ground. Use the dirty list of slave labor and cut surgically who is making poo in this process. How you cut out who made the problem and do not raise a trade barrier, because everybody knows that the most part of the time when a country raises a trade barrier under social justifications, in fact, it's protectionism. And we are working, first of all, to try to develop this commitment, but unfortunately, the countries are too afraid about signing, because I heard from several countries that, if you sign something like that, our social organizations in our territory will ask to develop something as Brazil to our country, to our works too, and we are not prepared. Second, I believe so much. Well, Brazil, we are facing, everybody is knowing that corruption denounces and so on and so on. And as Wagner told, we are facing now in Brazil not just a corruption washing moment that's very, very important in my opinion, but we are facing too a backlash of all progressist point of views. We have now in Brazil a conservative tide in several views. This conservative tide is killing the system to fight against slavery. The problem is not the government, because the fight against slavery, it's a state policy, it's not a government policy. It started with President Fernando Henrique Cardoso, passed through President Lula, and arrived in President Dilma. And it was created after the pushing for years for civil society organizations that were working for that from the ground. And now we are seeing the policy against slave labor under attack, under threat by these conservative groups that take advantage of this complicated moment of the country and attacking a lot this one. The people is trying to change the law, the definitions about slave labor, trying to become weaker the labor inspection, trying to put down the dirty list. Even me, I comment, I have lawsuits against me. I have criminal charges because I denounced slave labor. I not denounced it, let's take clear. I have criminal charges because I publicize that the government released workers in one farm. This never happened before. But now in Brazil we have this conservative type. And then I believe that there is a responsibility that could be made, that could be, we ask for the corporations that are partners from the Brazilian Pact for the Eradication of Slave Labor to work with their headquarters to bring these possibilities, to check the dirty list before buying products from Brazil, at the same time to promote decent work in their supply chain. Because sometimes they are buying products from Brazil and sending to China and sending to Bangladesh and sending to other parts of the globe. And even that the product left Brazil without slave labor, this supply chain is too long that can catch slave labor in other parts.
You're not going to let Chris off the hook, though, from
No.
To interrupt. I think it would be, you would, I'm right behind you, sorry.
Bagby, do you want to make a...
I think it would be good if you could explain, I mean, I don't know if you did that already, but what about the Brazilian definition about on forced labor? We have a definition, what we consider forced labor. There are many things that are considered forced labor in Brazil. There are basically 4 things. I would like Leonardo to explain it to you guys, so you guys could understand what the Brazilian Conservative Congress and what the conservative forces in Brazil are trying to change now. Could you do that, Leonardo? I think that would be...
If you could do that briefly, Leonardo, and then if we have a reminder of the question to Chris, so he can then address your points there. So, Leonardo, do you first want to follow that up and just give a brief overview of what forced labour is in Brazil and how the conservative movement is using it?
They will kill me because I speak a lot and talking a lot. And the Brazilian penal code, the Article 149 from Brazilian Penal Code, talking about what is slave labor. In Brazil, we consider slave labor 4 elements. First of all, what ILO called forced labor. Second, debit bondage, even that the debit bond could be considered debit bondage. These 2 elements talking about the freedom and the freedom of the worker to get out from their job. But Brazil in 2003, we went ahead from the definition. Because we consider that ILO definition, it's a ground, not a roof. And we went ahead. And considering that the element that is central, there is a central element in the slave labor that is not just the freedom, but is the dignity. the lack of dignity, the complete lack of dignity, makes someone just a disposal tool of work. Even that this person receives some amount of money. And then there is two other elements that we consider as slave labor too in Brazil. One, one is degraded conditions of work. It's not bad beds or just the food not in a sufficient amount. No, it's conditions that put the worker below the line of dignity. Water that you won't serve to animals, and very, very, very bad conditions. And exhaustive journey of work is the last element. That is not non-paid extra hours. The worker is obliged to work so much that he's not able to recover himself, and he puts in risk their life at the end of the journey. The Brazilian Congress today is trying to put down these two new elements and keep it with just the two first.
Okay, so they're trying to take the concept
They are trying
of
to
human
take
dignity out
off
of it.
degrading labor and exhaustive journey. And I just want to tell you guys that, I mean, I met President Dilma here in Colombia last week. And I mean, we all know that she's not in a very good moment in Brazil. We are going into a very big crisis. But she told me that that she's not going to allow, if the executive is not going to allow that, she's going to block it. If the Congress changed the Brazilian definition, she said that she is going to block it, which is a very good. But I think that we need international cooperation in that issue as well. So that's why I think it's important that you guys know about this.
Okay.
But the last piece about the exhaustive details of work, that's forced overtime.
Yeah.
That's what that is. And
Which
we
is what
see
is a
it
key
in our
ILO
supply
indicator, is that
chains
right?
Everywhere.
Absolutely.
Everywhere.
Absolutely.
12, 14, 16, 18 hours a day, often without food. And we talked about some of those cases, but we've spoken to workers everywhere where their biggest fear is to say, I want to go home to my families now. Thank you.
Okay.
Annie, can I?
Sorry.
Really briefly, because
We're really brief because I do really want to take some more questions.
Father
from
and
the floor.
Leonardo here, and I almost hesitate to say anything about Brazil, but I mean the rollback in Brazil, of course, you're very concerned about. But we shouldn't forget that Brazil has, in the past, been a world leader in the fight against slavery. One of the first to move from denial to acceptance, the first to strengthen its labour inspectorate, the first to do real interventions. And actually, let's remember also a couple of lessons from early slavery. Slaves in Brazil were organising and rising in revolt before the first industrial unions emerged in Europe. And just one point about ancient slavery, most slaves in the ancient world were also paid. You can be paid and be a slave.
Okay. I haven't forgotten your question. If you could keep it extremely brief, please.
We've heard about the criminal responsibility. That's extremely important. We've heard about particular supply chains and the complexities, if you like, and that's extremely important. But my question is really much simpler than that. What can we expect British employers, as constituents of the International Organization of Employers, to say to their Brazilian counterparts, the Brazilian Employers Federation, and how forcefully can we expect British employers to exercise their membership in the IOE with respect to, for example, their Brazilian counterparts, not only their Brazilian counterparts, but that's the question. Are employers willing to actually work with each other to make sure that the kinds of problems that Wagner and Leonardo have described don't recur?
Okay, and this, as you said, that is not just a question specific to Brazil. I imagine it's just Actually, can you respond really briefly to that? Thank you.
Very briefly. In respect to the IOE, it's very important that you all appreciate that there was virtually unanimous support for the protocol when it went through the ILO process. So you have a situation where the employer organisations around the world that represent the companies are clearly here now, ready to support this. In answer to your question with regards to explaining it to me, making it simpler for me, it's not a situation you have to explain it to me with regard to whether this can be made simple. because of the fact that I come from this from a perspective that we regretfully have to be pragmatic that this is a complex situation. And the reason I raise this is simply because of the fact that you've got issues of trade, you've got issues of competition, you've got issues of human rights, okay? And I'm not here to say that competition, okay, is more important than human.
Based on slavery, I hope not.
No, no. But this is what I'm leading you to is the fact that we have to have a role as business in being part of the solution to this issue. And what I'm not here to do is to give you a sound bite. What I'm not here to do is to give you support for the campaign and then take 2 steps back as I leave the room. What I'm here to do is to say that there is an irrefutable business case for all businesses globally to be socially responsible. And being socially responsible, as Sharon's quite clearly articulating, means that you need to take proactive steps to eradicate slavery in all its forms from all supply chains.
But Chris, you can help us by going with the TUC to the British government say, and they've got no reason not to, the UK slavery bill, sign the protocol. Because if we get how many countries ratifying it, Simon, it comes into law.
It's only 2.
Yeah, but Sharon.
We've only got
2, so
we've only got Nigeria.
Nigeria has signed
Yeah.
it.
Well, Sharon, let me put the pressure on my good friend Sam Gurney and Steve there, and to share with you, before we started this, we have a meeting with the DWP this week,
Very
and
good.
Steve and I are already talking about it. But this goes back to an answer to the question.
Will Sam say the right thing?
Well, he's got to. Aren't you his boss? Come on. But this goes back to the question with regards to what can responsible British businesses do. Part of this is we lobby. We lobby very hard, quietly in the corridors to make this stuff happen. But we need governments to support British business in this regard to raise everybody's level.
Okay, let's take another question. Is gentleman down here?
No.
Is there a microphone?
Brent.
Brent, this gentleman.
I don't know that many people call him a gentleman, but
Well, the former Secretary
Well,
General of the
it was like
IOE.
It was like when you lose, Sharon. Just in terms of this engagement, I think it's clear to say that the protocol was adopted in June. It's new. There's an opportunity in November for the governing body to start to explore the ratification process going forward. And speaking from a business perspective, from a company now, it would be good, because the IOE has already done some preliminary work on explaining the protocol and how it works, is to start a conversation amongst its membership in terms of some of these issues. And I think talking in this particular context to CNI, the Brazilian employers, is not a hard one to do with Alexander, who'll be there. But to start to explore how do we take this forward, because I think one of the challenges that we have, no one wants this. No one wants slavery, full stop, in your supply chain, in your backyard, in your family. No one wants it. But please, we need help. Being at the top of a large multinational, the view down gets very misty and very cloudy very quickly. And we need actors on the ground to come forward with issues for us. Please, not in an accusatory way, that just puts people into their pens.
Yep.
But if there's an issue, come and tell us about it. Beat us up if we don't do anything about it, but help us fix it where you find it. Because I need, through the Coca-Cola system and my supply chain, I need eyes on the ground, be they in Brazil, be they in any country in the world, to tell me if they are seeing evidence to suggest that there is in my supply chain slavery, then I'll do something about it. But please don't expect me to be able to see every part of the supply chain from Atlanta and act, or accuse me of not acting because I haven't seen it.
Sharon, thank you very much. Sharon, can I ask you whether do you think that that's a sufficient answer to say it's not, you can't expect businesses to be able to look in every murky corner of their own supply chains?
I think in regard to CEOs who speak like Brent, they're serious. But you know, we have to simplify the supply chain piece. If we can get agreement from our leaders on base erosion and profit shifting and the transparency of tax that needs to be paid where it's earned, we can get transparency of our supply chains. And yes, it's complex today, Chris, but Nike's done it. They actually shortened up their supply chain and they published it. Are they free? Brent's right. Are they free of every violation? No, but you can go talk to them. and they'll sit down at the table with unions, both locally and globally, and do something about it. Paul Polman wants to own his supply chain because he says we're not perfect, but we need to have the due diligence capacity to do that. Now, not every company will be able to own their supply chain, but transparency is no longer an excuse. They must be transparent. And so, yes, we'll work with, you know, Coca-Cola and Unilever and those that are serious, but unless you underpin it with due diligence, which means just that, transparent supply chains, then, you know, and that's why I said before, raise it once and people fix it. I don't want the employers to go to jail. Raise it twice, I might want them to be sanctioned. 3 times, sorry, they're out, they're in jail. So there are ways we could sort this out on a reasonable basis, but it needs the rule of law.
Do you think, yes, let's take another question from the floor, and then I've got a point I'd like to address. The lady there at the back?
It's more complicated than manufacturing.
If you could just introduce yourself briefly at the beginning as well, that'd be great.
Hi, my name's Jessica. I work with Department for International Development and previously worked for a women's legal organisation that worked with people that were enslaved. I pick up your points that slavery is a symptom in many cases, and we've been talking a lot about legislation and rule of law, and that's very relevant, particularly from Britain, from countries that have strong rule of law in general. I'm concerned that in countries where the rule of law is very weak across the board, where we have high levels of corruption, and also in sectors of slavery such as domestic work, where people aren't part of massive companies, we're going to be missing those people completely if we're just focusing on legislation and if we're just focusing on that high-level governance approach.
Well, that's right. But what did Mauritania just do? The government suspended the visas. Yeah. What's Indonesia talking about doing? Not allowing their workers to go into the Gulf states. So, you know, yes, you're right. Wherever we can find visibility and remedy to fix it, and I agree with you about corruption, but let's think about at what level we have to do what Chris says, actually, lobby or take, if necessary, you know, other steps. The fair recruitment process that the ILO's engaged in is absolutely fundamental, and, you know, I was going to lobby the IOM, although I think I've missed them today, but, you know, their IRIS piece where they want to make transparent the criteria for recruitment companies for domestic workers and so on, it's got to be based on the rule of law, the ILO fundamentals and the fair recruitment process, and then we might think it's reasonable. But I agree with you totally, but you still got to look at what points of intervention we can make that really bring serious sanctions on those people who are corrupt.
Sharon,
Sure.
Can I just come back and just say that you raised it this way. First of all, the point you made about tax. Absolutely right. The protocol says we need universal coverage of labour inspection to ensure that all workers are protected. That's one of the ways where Brazil did lead, in labour inspection. That's absolutely clear. But I also think the other point is, you know, the agricultural supply chains, value chains, particularly when you reach out into really isolated villages in the rural economy, and I've done a lot of work in those, they're quite tough to reach. And the response, and in fact you made the point I think this morning, that the response also needs to be bottom up as well as top down. That we need to be finding ways to reach those value chains, and in a sense, yes, I suppose you could say by shortening them, promoting, for example, the formation of cooperatives of smallholders. So you don't have hundreds of tiny smallholders acting independently, but together with a democratic governance system in their own co-ops. That's one way in sugar, in cocoa, in a whole series of other commodities of shortening agricultural supply chains in isolated rural areas that are harder to inspect and where we do have a shed load of modern slavery, without doubt, in a number of countries around the world. That's the bottom-up empowerment bit about the community-based diligence and enforcement and ownership of anti-slavery and anti-child labour policy.
Does that answer
I want to
question?
pick up on what you were just saying. When we're prioritising approaches around legislation and around prevention by sort of educating or providing services to vulnerable groups, or perhaps even just general strengthening of rule of law initiatives, where do you see those priorities being? Do you think that legislation is the most effective when we're talking about numbers, or do you think there still is a place for prevention initiatives, upskilling initiatives of vulnerable people.
I don't think you can separate it.
Yeah.
I mean, we would say all of the above.
All of the above.
But it is the system, and that's part and parcel of it, is all of those things. But for us, the voice of the worker, with an end to impunity, the voice of the worker, collectively, individually, must be heard. And if they can't raise their voice, and in the context of the corrupt systems you talk about, have a compliance system that, if it's not going to work domestically, works globally, then we have lost the argument. So yes, of course, prevention, but if you're a desperate worker, you know, and your family is starving, you're going to take a job. You're going to take the job. So it's what I say a little bit about consumer power. Yes, use it, but don't blame the consumer. Actually put the rule of law back to where the responsibility belongs. And I wanted to say Brazil has done just that. They've tried, they've put the rule of law in place. It's the fight back there that is creating the problem. And you're alluding to that in some countries, and I'll tell you the story that makes my blood boil, which you'll understand. We have had people rescuing domestic workers, but in fact, when they go to court, particularly in corrupt court systems or in police states, in the Gulf states as well, in the police states, then they're the victims. The rescuers become the people who are charged. The women are already either in jail or deported, and the perpetrator gets off. So for me, there is no argument against actually cleaning up the rule of law, because if we don't, then frankly we're really raising expectations that people will just be the victims of.
And I think domestic workers is very interesting, isn't it? Because it's the crystallisation of lots of different elements that feed modern slavery, and it'd be quite interesting to come back to that if we have time. Can we take another question from the floor?
Yeah, I just want to say we're very happy that the GLA could come today. They're one of the main partners of the campaign. So.
Aurelie has sprung this on me. I've come with no notes or anything, but I'd like to introduce myself. My name's Liz Ford, and I'm an enforcement officer with the Gangmasters Licensing Authority. I'm also here to say there is light at the end of the tunnel, and we have started in our own very small way through regulation to address this issue of slavery and forced labour in supply chains. For those of you that don't know, the Gangmasters Licensing Authority was set up in 2004 in response to the cocklepicker disaster, where 26 Chinese cocklepickers drowned to death at Morecambe Bay. We'd also had problems about 5 years before then, where Chinese workers were found in the back of a refrigerated lorry in Dover Docks, and they'd suffocated to death. The government at the time has addressed the problem by creating us, and so what we do is we regulate the sector of agriculture, horticulture, shellfish gathering and food processing and packaging. Very small, but we have started through regulation giving the workers a voice. We go onto farms. My job as an enforcement officer, I will go onto a farm and I will pick workers randomly to talk to give them a voice through an interpreter to tell me what's happening. And they do. Sometimes they tell me an awful lot more, and I can't comment on my colleague from Unite Union, but Channel 4 were very, very gutted because I was already investigating that job and they came to it late. So it shows that regulation does work. What we do is we will look that the workers are paying tax. We will look that they are being employed properly. We will look to see that they have proper health and safety measures and that they're receiving annual leave. But the other side of my job as the enforcement officer, we've quickly come to realise that we are looking at supply chains that are being fed by organised crime groups. Let's make no doubt about this. Whenever there are vulnerable workers, there are people that want to make money on the back of them. When I was fortunate enough to be in Aurelie's lesson on forced labour, I had a German colleague, I'm sure Aurelie will remember, and he said, you always have to follow the money. And he's right. You always follow the money and you will get to the people that are exploiting these people, because at the point of contact they are vulnerable. They are asked if they want a job in the UK. Yes, please, they say, because they haven't got very much money at home. They are then offered work for which they have to pay for. Now, that work, in the UK alone I'm talking about, they can pay anything from £200 to £400 just for work. Then they are offered transport. That can be anything from £100 to £200, and whoever is controlling them in their home country, now I'm talking mainly about Eastern Europeans, workers, they will be given accommodation, and at that point they're controlled. Now, they are fed into licensed agencies, and those licensed agencies that we regulate can unwittingly employ these workers, but then, after that, they think everything is fine. But in actual fact, those workers have given over their documents. They've actually, they get their pay, because we insist that they get paid into their own bank accounts. But in actual fact, the gangmasters are controlling their money. So you've still got this situation, and even if workers are moved from one farm to another, suddenly that debt bondage goes up, and they're never ever free of it. So it's always about isolation of that victim, and it's, from my point, it's giving workers a voice. Very quickly, we are working with the supermarkets, and have done for 2 to 3 years now, with the Association of Labour Providers, working on a project called Stronger Together. Now, that is getting all agents and the supermarkets involved to actually look at this problem of modern slavery, because it is going on, and unless we give them a voice, and I must disagree with you a little bit, Chris, because if you're actionable, you take action, you regulate, we have demonstrated that you can be successful.
Okay,
and it is working in partnership with the police to get an outcome, a suitable outcome at the end. I could go on, Aurelie knows I could, but I hope that just to demonstrate that we have started.
No, and I think it's a very good point about the real face of modern slavery as well. That's not a situation that I think, certainly in our reporting at The Guardian, we've realised that quite often what would be legally considered slavery is not recognised as such by many people. So they are kind of invisible forms. So
We just need to clone her everywhere. Can we do that?
any other?
Many of whom they've got labour inspectors in Brazil.
Should we take another few questions from the floor? I'm conscious that we're running out of time. The gentleman at the front.
Hi, I'm Bruce Goldstein with Farm Worker Justice in the United States, where there continues to be slavery. And I was wondering whether the campaign for the protocol will be taken to the United States. Now, I understand that the United States may not be eligible to adopt the new protocol because it never ratified the original 1930 convention, but I still wonder whether there will be a campaign in the United States.
They ratify now, they're 29, if in 80 years they ratify the protocol.
But, I mean, we all, despair of the US not ratifying international law, but there is a campaign, there's a huge campaign, and actually a lot of the support for this came out of both NGOs like yourself, but the unions and decent employers saying, we don't want to actually employ, migrant workers, often children, who are effectively enslaved in our supply chain. So I wouldn't give up on the US. Maybe ratification's a stretch, but I wouldn't give up on them. And we'll tell Tom Perez that there's a big push from Europe to, kind of get it going in the US. They will, without doubt, make it fundamental to trade deals. Now, we've all got some problems with trade deals, but there's no doubt in my mind that the US will make it fundamental to trade deals in the context of those fundamental rights and conventions.
And Bruce, the campaign is a universal campaign for ratification. The campaign for ratification of the fundamental conventions is a universal. We're almost there with the Convention on Forced Labour. We have 8 to go. We're almost there with the worst forms of child labour convention. We have 6 to go. But meanwhile, your friend and mine, Baldemar Velasquez, the leader of the Farm Labour Organising Committee, he says something that I think everybody will recognise on both sides of the negotiating table. If you hit the exploiters where it hurts most in their pockets, you diminish the profits they can make from forced labour. And one of the ways you do that is not just by bringing them to account through law. It's by doing what you and Baldemar and others are doing, which is seeking to help organise migrant workers in the fields and the orchards and the farms so they have a voice, so they can have agency. And that's the key point about this. You know, we talk about people in forced labour as though there is no agency left. I've sat in child labour, child protection committees in Nepal where half the members were bonded labourers. This is complex. This is complex. People in bonded labour organise themselves to fight against slavery. It isn't about, you know, the 7th Cavalry arriving and saying, here guys, we're here to free you. People fight back when they're oppressed. In some cases, the oppression is so great there is no possibility to do so. That's for sure. But we do see linked to this at the bottom of the value chain, people getting together, getting to the economic root causes, getting to have collective voice, but we need the legal framework that makes that possible. We need the law that protects that ability to organise, that ability to have voice, and we need labour inspection to enforce the law.
Okay. Marcia.
Hi, just a quick reply. I'm Marcia Poole. I'm the Communications Director of the ILO. And to say that, yes, in due course, 50 for Freedom will be rolled out in the United States. The campaign, as Simon said, in the first instance, we want to try and get at least 50 countries to sign up by 2018. But we're looking beyond that, and we hope that by 2030, which is the centenary of the convention, the 1930 Convention on Forced Labor, that we would have universal ratification, not just of the convention, but also of the protocol. Thank you.
I'd like to take just one final question from the floor. Does anyone have a question that they'd like to ask the panel? Lady here at the front.
Yes, sorry, I think it's great what you raised a moment ago about workers do, or any of us. I mean, I've worked abroad in other countries, and at one time paying
Could you just briefly tell us?
Sorry, Kate Larson. One time paying a fee, many, many years ago. So you know, it's not that everybody's a victim. It can be anybody. And an example of that was Japan after the earthquake, that some Chinese workers went back to China when they felt that conditions were no longer satisfying them, shall we say, and the Chinese government stepped in. And that was my question, which is that in my experience of Chinese workers in Japan, the Chinese government or entity, some entity of the Chinese government had a policy that workers need to pay 30,000 RMB to go and work in Japan. And these are in legal conditions, and there were a good 10 or 15 brands working together to assess conditions which varied. Some were a great opportunity, and some were bordering on what we're talking about. So my question is, given that China's such a big player, any thoughts on engaging when there's that level of a situation going on? And secondly, what I'd add to that is that, you know, what is your opinion on, so there is a flight that needs to happen between China to Japan to get the opportunity for that young lady in these cases to earn 10 times what she would earn in China. You know, how do we get over the fact that in some ways maybe she should be the one to pay for that? And as long as there's a reasonable time within which she has earned enough money to pay that back, and all other laws and freedom of movement and communication are in place, you know, who's going to pay everybody says employers are going to pay it, but we would have seen, or right now I think we would still see that the woman would not be having these opportunities to A, have the training, and B, earn 10 times the amount. So it's the nuance of it that we're all on the same page. We want fundamental rights, but what are your thoughts on these nuances?
Okay. Do you understand what the question is?
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, where do you draw the line? We have people who say, but it's okay to work at 13, really. This person's very mature and they ought to be able to work. It's child labour. So we have a convention, 151, am I right, Simon? I always get
Which
this.
one? On what?
About
On
contract,
the
and the fact that If a company is contracting workers
No, one
from
thing
another
is
country,
Labour relations in the public
sorry, I
sector.
can't remember.
Don't
Anyway,
worry, it's labour relations in the public sector. I know what the one you mean.
but there is a convention that clearly says if you're contracting worker through a recruitment agency or indeed directly to work with you, that it's illegal to pay fees.
Absolutely.
So I'm totally uncompromising on that because yes, she may be able to afford it, but the workers that I meet from India, Nepal paying up to $2,000 US or even 300,
Yep.
you know, when they have nothing, which actually debt makes them so indebted they can't leave, then that's not acceptable. So I say, don't give us exemptions. Where do you draw the line? And frankly, fees to, you know, for the honour of working for someone who wants your labour are illegal. That's it.
Absolutely.
Okay.
It's Convention 181 on
181.
181 on private employment
There you go.
agencies, and I remember
Oh,
the
it's
boss
close.
the boss of Manpower used to say if everybody ratified Convention 181 and implemented it, we would eliminate most of the
fly-by-nighters,
internationally moved and internally moved forced labour.
Because
in
quite
the world.
often recruitment fees are
facilitation fees,
Yeah.
essentially facilitation fees are one of the first steps to debt bondage. And we've even seen it in Europe. We've even seen it in public services in Europe, where workers, for example, from the Philippines have been recruited by employment agencies and then working in public services, housed in accommodation tied to the labour broker with rents that are greater than their wages. That's debt bondage.
Yeah.
And facilitation fees are really one of the biggest problems.
And it increases that vulnerability,
And
doesn't
I
it?
would say we have a big problem with some Chinese companies whose investment model means they take their workforce with them. Sometimes they're not even paid in the country. It's in some bank account back home at Chinese rates. And they're often enslaved in quarters, even offshore. Sometimes the companies take a boat. It used to be mostly in Africa. Now we're seeing it in Latin America. And so, you know, once you start kind of carving out those little bits, then you give up, basically, the fundamental rule of law which says this is not acceptable.
Okay, so we have reached the end of the session. What we're going to do is we're just going to take a very, very brief closing statements from everybody, just summarising what you would, kind of final thoughts. Maybe we could start with Wagner. If you have any final thoughts that you'd like to say on anything you've heard today.
Oh no, I just wanted to thank you guys. I think I've learned a lot today by being with you. I think it was a very important discussion. I think it's a very, I think it's very important that we're launching this campaign, like Marcia said, in the whole world. And let's hope that we are going to eradicate this scourge from our society in the next decade. So thank you.
Thank you. So final thoughts?
I just want to say thank you. Thank you to all the partners working on this. You know, if we can get to a point where business doesn't do business in slave states or doesn't do business with contractors in supply chains or in, you know, recruitment agencies that are fly-by-night agencies, then we will actually make real progress. But it does require us all to say this is a criminal act and we don't want slavery in our communities, as Brent said, in our backyards or in our supply chains. It will take all of us. So thank you.
Thank you. Chris?
Well, I'm a thank you. Sorry.
Sorry.
Well, I'm a thank you as well, principally because, one, thank you for giving me the opportunity to join you today, but secondly, because of my role on the governing body in the ILO for UK employers, it's very important for me to get your comments in this regard. And what I'm taking away from this is the resounding comments in respect of the importance of the rule of law. Okay, now part of my role is to lobby governments, and therefore this has been really helpful, and I make no apology for being provocative. I like to be told when I'm getting things wrong or when you agree, because that helps me do a better job. So I thank you for your honesty, and if you have any further comments you wish to raise with me outside of this forum, I'm sure there are ways through the ILO we can be in contact to help me lobby governments in that regard. So thank you.
Thank you. Leonardo?
Thank you so much for the invitation. Thank you to the moment of discussion. I just would like to remember the central role of the state on this process is very, very important. Sometimes we think, no, the companies are the central player on this one, the civil society, the workers, the state must participate very deeply on this process. The Brazilian model just worked properly because we got the commitment of the state. Not the commitment as we would like to, but we got the commitment. Because of course that self-auditing, self-statement, everything is important, but it's more important the work of labor inspectors, the work of labor prosecutors, the work of attorney general, the worker of the approval of laws. This is important. And remember that even that international companies, international corporations are very, very important, and some of them hijack the entire countries. The sovereignty is something from countries and states and not companies. And it's time to some states take back their sovereignty. Is this? Thank you.
Thank you. And finally, last but not least, Simon.
Thanks, a great discussion. Thank you ever so much. I am reminded by a number of comments that were made by not an anecdote, a true story, that my friend Kailash Satyarthi, who I've worked very closely with for many years, tells about a time he and his colleagues raided a circus in North India and liberated some children who'd been trafficked from Nepal. And there was a little girl, she was 9 years old. She was terrified, she had been abused, she was in the most appalling condition. And we've talked about, I think it was Wagner that said, you know, we have people who don't know they're in forced labour. I actually well up when I tell this story because Kyla says, this child didn't know that she and I were members of the same human race. Exactly. She didn't know she was a human being. That's the extent of the bottom of this misery that we have to fight. And in response, in fact, coming back to Reese's point, that's one of the reasons why education of vulnerable communities, vulnerable people, work we've done to raise awareness against the risks of migration in China, for example. We did a huge campaign to educate young workers migrating to the Pearl River Delta against the risks of ending up in situations of trafficking and forced labour. Educating communities and vulnerable people. Educating employers and supporting them to deal with the challenges in the value chain. The need for law, for labour inspection, for penalties, and for functioning labour relations systems that can reach right down to where everybody is doing work so people can work in freedom. And we get to the economic root causes. We want to eliminate child labour, and to do that we need a fair globalisation. We want a fair globalisation, we have to eliminate forced labour. That's the bottom line, the two sides of the same coin. If we want a fair globalisation, you can't have it without eliminating forced labour. And if you are serious about getting rid of forced labour, you need to support fundamental rights at work and all the pillars of the decent work agenda. So we have a fair globalisation where everybody has the opportunity, youth, women and men, to work in freedom, in dignity and security.
Thank you. Thank you very much to all the panellists. It's been a very, very interesting discussion. Thank you very, very much to the audience. Brilliant questions. Before you all leave, I would like to introduce Marcia, who you've already heard from. Marcia Poole, the Director of the Department of Communications for the International Labour Organization, and she's going to just explain a little bit more about the campaign and how you can get involved. Thank you.
Probably not, I think. Before. That's all right. Just a few quick words. But before, thank you. Before I tell you a little bit more about the campaign, I'd like to thank you and Annie Kelly from The Guardian for moderating this discussion, and the media and The Guardian for the work you're doing, in bringing this to public attention. Thank you. And I know you have to run, so thank you very much.
I've got another thing to do. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Leonardo, you run in London tomorrow.
Until tomorrow night.
Okay. cool. Okay, thank you.
And I'm not sure, I know we have lost the video link with Bogota in Colombia. I'm not sure whether Wagner Moura can still see us, but I would like to thank him also. It's quite early in the morning in Colombia, and I know he was working until late last night, and early this morning he took the time off to be here with us. So in the hope that he is listening to us, I'd like to thank him as well. Just to tell you a little bit more about the campaign. As Simon's already mentioned, it's a 3-year campaign. I mentioned the fact that the first 50 countries to ratify the protocol, we've already got one, we've got Niger. This is just the beginning. We hope to see many more countries ratifying it, and certainly to have universal ratification by 2030. So over the next 3 years, we'll be rolling out the campaign. Next month, we'll be launching the campaign in Zambia. End of next month, we should be launching it in Argentina as well, and Brazil is penciled in for January. The campaign is led by the ILO with the IOE and the ITUC, but we have other partners. You can see them on the platform. I'm not sure whether we can get the page on the platform where you can see some of our partners, but if we can't, I can tell you obviously the well, there we are, the ETI, the IOM, Migrant Forum, Anti-Slavery, the Reporter Brazil, and others, the GLA. We'll be working with the partners to create content and add content to the platform. I think the next material we're going to have is going to be from the GLA. We're working with the GLA on some stories of change, because the campaign itself works on 2 levels. There is the global level, which is where we want to bring the partners together and build awareness, as we've been discussing today, of modern slavery and of how people can help eradicate it. And then there is the national level where ratification actually takes place. Now, the platform is meant to support both levels of the campaign, so it's got 2 main purposes. On one hand, it's a space where the partners come together, where people can learn about slavery, they can learn about what's working in terms of sharing good practice, stories of change, but it's also an advocacy tool. This is the toolkit where people can sign up and they can see, if I want to help, if I want to join the campaign, what can I do? What can I do in my community as well? I mentioned that we'll be adding content to it. Soon we hope to have a special section on business and what is it that business can do to help the campaign. And the other dimension of the platform is an advocacy tool. When it comes to the national ratification effort, we're hoping to capture in a very visual form. And in this app there, can get down to a city, for example, where we can go. I mentioned Argentina, I mentioned Zambia, Brazil, where we can go and say, look, in your country, these are how many people who are supporting the campaign, who are in favor of ratification. So it helps our colleagues, our partners, our constituents at the country level to show the general support that we have for the campaign. So I would encourage you, if you haven't yet done so, to actually sign up, because your signing up onto the campaign actually counts in terms of showing the support that we have for ratification. And we have the board, and I know some of you signed the board, most of you signed the board, and there was a bit of a confusion as to if you've signed the board, should you sign up on the platform as well? Yes, because the board it's a symbolism, it's a way of showing the support that we have for the campaign. But in terms of being able to use it as an advocacy tool, it's the platform that I urge you all to sign if you haven't done so. So just before we leave, I would like to invite, and I think we've lost Sharon, but we have, yes. But we've got Chris, Leonardo, Simon here. I'd like to invite you to unveil the panel that people have been signing over the past day and a half. Thank you all.
Really, without Sharon.